Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's edition of COVID-19 stay-at-home lectures. And today we're going to be talking about the autonomic nervous system. Within the autonomic nervous system, we're going to talk about comparing the autonomic to the in relation to the peripheral nervous system, talk about some different pathways and neurotransmitters that are occurring within the autonomic nervous system, differentiate between parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems, talk about how the autonomic nervous system divisions are linked to the central nervous system, talk about the different hormones that are involved with each division, and discuss how the body responds to fight or flight or rest and digest situations. And then finally talk about how different types of drugs impact the sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic nervous system. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So as a general reminder, in terms of how we divide our nervous system, we have the central nervous system, which we all should know by now is our brain and our spinal cord. And then we have our peripheral nervous system, which is virtually everything else. And we divide our peripheral nervous system into the sensory or afferent division, which will send sensory impulses from the body or from the environment up to the central nervous system. And then we also have this other division called the motor division, the efferent division of the peripheral nervous system, which will take information from that is made in the central nervous system and sent along these motor axons to target effectors, whether they be muscles or glands, etc. And then we further subclassify our motor or efferent division into the somatic nervous system or the autonomic nervous system. And we've already talked about the somatic nervous system. This is the one that innervates, these are the motor fibers that innervate the skeletal muscles. And so today we're going to focus on autonomic nervous system, which is going to be the motor fibers that innervate the smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and the glands of the body. We can break this autonomic nervous system down into two subdivisions. We have the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division. And as a general introduction here, I will just tell you that sympathetic is going to be fight or flight. And then parasympathetic is going to be rest and digest system. Okay. So let's talk about each of these a little more. So just to kind of introduce you, to give you an overview of the autonomic nervous system, remember this system is a motor system. So it's going to consist of motor neurons that innervate our smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and the glands. And the job of the autonomic nervous system is to make adjustments to our body processes to ensure optimal support for any kind of body activities. For example, it shunts blood to areas that might need it. It will adjust our heart rate, our blood pressure, digestive processes, all of these processes that we kind of think of as being automatic, okay? So we don't have any any conscious control over these processes, okay? So because of that, we say that the autonomic nervous system operates via subconscious control. We're not consciously able to alter, per se, our autonomic nervous system. The other names for the autonomic nervous system, sometimes you might hear it referred to as the involuntary nervous system, which makes sense because we don't have voluntary control over it. And sometimes it's called the general visceral motor system. And visceral is just referring to the idea that it's innervating things like smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. Okay. All right. Oops. All right. So moving on, we're going to start discussing the autonomic versus the somatic nervous system. So last week in the peripheral nervous system, we talked a lot about somatic nervous system. And remember, somatic nervous system is the one that goes on to innervate our skeletal muscle. Okay, so we can see that over here. So some of the biggest similarity really between the autonomic and the somatic nervous system is that both have these motor fibers. However, there are some major differences, and we're going to discuss each of these differences over the next couple of slides. The first difference here is their effectors. And so somatic nervous system effector would be skeletal muscle. Autonomic is going to be smooth muscle, glands, and cardiac muscle. Another major difference here would be the efferent pathways and the ganglia that are associated. So that's going to be sort of in this section, and I'll break it down when we get a little bit closer to it. And then finally, a third major difference would be the target organ responses to the neurotransmitters. So for example, the skeletal muscle, whenever it's stimulated by a motor neuron in the somatic nervous system, it's always going to be a stimulatory effect, okay? So it's always going to result in muscle contraction. However, in the autonomic nervous system, that's not necessarily the case. The effect on the target organ can either be stimulatory or inhibitory. It just depends on which neurotransmitter and which receptors are present. Okay, so let's talk about some of these differences then. We'll start here with the effectors. Oops, my apologies. I'll go back one. So the somatic nervous system, as I've already mentioned, major differences between somatic and autonomic nervous system, the effector organs. So the somatic nervous system we see is the one that innervates our skeletal muscle. The autonomic nervous system is the one that's going to be innervating our cardiac muscle, our smooth muscle, and also some glands. Okay, so that's major difference number one. Major difference number two, let's talk about these efferent pathways and ganglia. So in the somatic nervous system, so we'll start here in the somatic nervous system, the cell bodies of somatic neurons are going to be within the central nervous system. So they might be in the spinal cord, they might be in the brain, but these particular neurons, it's a single thick myelinated axon that's going to extend in the spinal or the cranial nerves and go directly to its skeletal muscle. Okay, so it's one single neuron from the central nervous system to the effector organ. Okay, so in the autonomic nervous system, however, the autonomic nervous system is going to use this two neuron chain. And basically what this means is that instead of having one neuron that goes from the central nervous system all the way to the target, we're going to have two neurons along the way. And we call these neurons different things. So we're going to have first what's called the preganglionic neuron. Okay, and both of these, so this one and this one, these are both preganglionic neurons. And they have cell bodies that are in the central nervous system. their axons are only lightly myelinated. Okay, so lightly myelinated axons. And these axons of the preganglionic neurons are going to end at what are called a ganglion. Okay, what's called a ganglion, which is basically just a cluster where we're going to find the cell bodies of our postganglionic neuron. Okay, and these postganglionic neurons, you can see here, their axons are non-myelinated, right? So that brings up the idea of myelination and what is the purpose of myelination. And if you guys remember, whenever we were talking about myelin and myelinating things, we were talking about the fact that myelination helps to speed up the transmission of nerve impulses. So, somatic nervous system motor neurons, super fast, right? They're really heavily myelinated. The autonomic nervous system, well, the preganglionic axons, they're going to be maybe medium speed because they do have a little bit of myelin, but those postganglionic axons don't have any myelin on them, so they're going to be very slow in comparison to the lightly or the heavily myelinated axons. So it's just important to keep in mind that these autonomic neurons actually transmit more slowly than what these somatic neurons do, and that's just simply due to the fact that the somatic neurons are heavily myelinated, whereas the autonomic are not. So we talked about the idea of these preganglionic axons, and these are sympathetic nervous system preganglionic, and here are parasympathetic, still part of the that are, you see on these ganglion. Okay, and that's where they're going to find the cell body of the postganglionic axons. So here's a postganglionic axon, and here's a postganglionic axon. All right. These postganglionic neurons, they're located outside of the central nervous system, right? Because the preganglionic cell bodies are in the CNS, but the postganglionic cell bodies are somewhere outside of the CNS. And so the cell body then is going to receive information from this preganglionic axon in what's called an autonomic ganglion. And then that postganglionic axon is going to eventually extend to the receptor, which is going to be located on whatever effector organ we're targeting. So say it's the heart, then this postganglionic neuron would receive information from the preganglionic, and then its axon would travel to the heart, synapse onto the heart, and cause the whatever effect we wanted it to cause. Okay. So the third major difference between the autonomic and somatic nervous system is the effect of the neurotransmitters. So this is going to be really important to understand that in the somatic nervous system, all of these neurons release acetylcholine onto their effector organ, and that's what causes ultimately the contraction of muscle, okay, of skeletal muscle. The effect in the somatic nervous system, anytime that acetylcholine is released onto a skeletal muscle, it's going to be a stimulatory effect. And by stimulatory, basically this means that an action potential is going to happen. So, stimulatory equals action potential. Okay. When we look at the autonomic nervous system, there are some similarities. So the preganglionic axons also release acetylcholine every time. Preganglionic axons always release acetylcholine. The difference, however, is that the postganglionic neurons are going to release either norepinephrine or epinephrine or acetylcholine. It just depends on what the goal is here. Okay, so the parasympathetic autonomic fibers are going to release acetylcholine onto their effectors. The sympathetic nervous system is going to release either norepinephrine or epinephrine onto its effectors. And just because, so let's say we're talking about acetylcholine here, just because acetylcholine gets released onto its target does not mean that it's always going to be stimulatory like it was up here in the somatic nervous system. The action of acetylcholine on its target organ here in the autonomic nervous system depends on what type of receptors are present on the target organ. If they have stimulatory receptors, then acetylcholine will cause a stimulatory effect. If they have inhibitory receptors for acetylcholine, then the presence of acetylcholine will inhibit action potentials from occurring. All right, so it just depends on the receptors that are present on the target tissue. Okay, so we've talked about some major differences, but let's talk about some overlap here because it's going to be easier to keep this in your mind if you understand the similarities and then can compare the differences. So in terms of both the somatic and the autonomic nervous system, we always have a higher brain center that's going to be regulating and coordinating the systems. Okay, so the brain is always involved in both somatic and autonomic regulation. In addition, most of our spinal and many of the cranial nerves contain both somatic and autonomic fibers. Okay, so let's think about this for a second, and that's also why I have this over here. So this is going to be our example of the spinal nerve, right? So if we remember back to last week's lecture, we have the spinal cord being here. Here would be our motor fibers. So we're going to have both a visceral or an autonomic fiber and a somatic fiber exiting through the ventral root of the spinal cord. And remember that the dorsal root plus the ventral root, when those things come together, that creates our very short spinal nerve. So now we can see that we would have the sensory fibers in here in the spinal nerve, and we would also have visceral motor and somatic motor fibers. All right, so we'd have all three fiber types in this spinal nerve. Then we would see our somatic motor neurons going through the dorsal ramus and then also the ventral ramus, and those somatic motor that go through the ventral ramus are going to go to the muscles of the body wall and the limbs, and those somatic motor fibers that exit through the dorsal ramus are going to the skeletal muscles that are on the back. All right, this should all be reviewed for you because we learned about this last week. Now let's see what's a little bit different. So a little bit different is this blue fiber. So we have this visceral motor. So here's going to be our preganglionic fiber. It's going to exit the central nervous system through the spinal nerve, and then it's going to go into what's called the white ramus of the rami communicantes. And at this point, it's going to synapse in a ganglion Remember from that first discussion of the table with the 4 things across it. So we're going to have this pre-ganglionic fiber synapsing onto its postganglionic fiber, which is here in black, in this ganglion. And then this postganglionic fiber is going to travel in 2 different directions. It's going to travel back up towards the spinal nerve, exit out the ventral ramus to the smooth muscles, the glands of the body wall and the limbs, also to the through the dorsal ramus, and that's where we're going to send postganglionic fibers to the smooth muscles and the glands and whatnot on the back, right? So on our posterior body. In addition, we're also going to send a postganglionic fiber out to the smooth muscles, the glands, and the visceral organs in the thorax, in the thoracic cavity, so things like our lungs and our heart, rib areas. And so remember, this preganglionic, this blue fiber, it synapses on its postganglionic fiber with the black one here in the sympathetic ganglion, but that's only one branch of it. So there's another branch that's actually going to continue through the sympathetic nerve, which will go down and synapse on postganglionic fibers closer to where it's going to innervate the abdomen and the pelvis areas, the digestive system structures, urinary system structures, and so on. Okay, so I just wanted to point that out, and hopefully that makes sense, all the different fibers that are actually running within a spinal nerve. So in terms of this coordinating of somatic and autonomic functions, any kind of major adaptations that we need to make usually are going to involve both skeletal and visceral muscles and organs. So for example, if you are working out, then you're using your skeletal muscle, and because you're activating your skeletal muscle, this is going to require that skeletal muscle to have more oxygen and more glucose. And so in order to help you continue working out, the autonomic nervous system is actually also going to speed up the heart rate. And by speeding up the heart rate, that means oxygen, which travels in blood, can be delivered more quickly, and same with glucose, can be delivered more quickly to the skeletal muscle. And the autonomic nervous system will also open the airways, and this will allow you to inhale more oxygen so that you can put that oxygen onto your blood cells, and those blood cells can travel to the skeletal muscle. All right, so hopefully you guys, this makes sense as to how we can work together to accomplish a task in terms of overlap of the somatic and autonomic nervous systems. All right, so now that we've talked about and compared the somatic and the autonomic nervous system, we're going to begin discussing the divisions of the autonomic nervous system. So the autonomic nervous system is broken down into the parasympathetic division and the sympathetic division. So the parasympathetic division, which you see over here on the right side, this yellow sort of things, the parasympathetic division is going to be what promotes our maintenance functions and also helps us to conserve energy. All right, so this is going to be called our rest and digest system. Okay, so another important thing to note here is that the parasympathetic nervous system is arising from the cranial or the brain and the sacral parts, right? So you can see where the fibers are coming out of the cranial region and then the sacral region. Okay, so these are going to be our parasympathetic origins. The sympathetic nervous system is going to basically mobilize our body during any kind of physical activity. So this is something that we call our fight or flight division. All right, so it helps prepare the body to either fight a fear or run away from a fear. And I'll explain what that means as we move on a little bit throughout the lecture. But just to kind of break this one down, you can see that this particular division is originating from the thoracic and lumbar regions of the spinal cord. Okay, so that's where you see all these little blue fibers coming out. These are the preganglionic sympathetic fibers. Okay, now what's important to pay attention to and to note here is that this idea of dual innervation. Okay, and dual innervation basically refers to the fact, or the idea rather, that all visceral organs are served by both divisions, but the divisions have opposite effects. And so basically what this is referring to is, I don't know, let's say, for example, let's look here at the lungs. We see that the parasympathetic division is going to constrict the airways, but the sympathetic division is going to relax the airways. So by having innervation by both systems, we're able to maintain a really nice balance in between the two systems. So that's what makes this so critical for maintaining homeostasis. Now, there are a couple of exceptions in which things are not dually innervated, and I'll just point those out now. So, for example, we see sweat glands, only sympathetic, okay? Adrenal gland, which sits on top of the kidney, only has sympathetic innervation, okay? So I just wanted to point out a couple of those exceptions, and I think I'll talk about them later in this lecture as well. So on this slide, I'm giving you guys a table that has the effects of the parasympathetic and the sympathetic divisions on a various amount of different organs. And so I would use this table to study for your exam. And the way that I recommend doing this is, well, this is pretty much the way that I learned this, is that just pick one and memorize one, and then the opposite, the other division, it's the opposite. So in the way that I sort of, I guess, remember this is by kind of conducting this big scenario in my head of, say, I don't know, like you're in a horror movie type situation, and you're in the woods and you're literally just running for your life because an attacker is coming after you. Okay. This is going to activate the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, so it's going to be sympathetic nervous system. And I remember that this is sympathetic nervous system because I always conduct in my mind this scenario that if I'm running for my life, my body probably just feels bad for me. It feels sympathy for me. So it's going to do these things to make my life a little bit easier, okay? For example, the sympathetic nervous system, when you are running for your life, it is going to dilate your pupils so that you can see better. It is going to flatten the lens in your eye so that you can see farther, because remember, you're running through the woods, so let's dilate our pupils so we can see things better. Let's flatten our lens so we can see further up ahead of us. Additionally, it's going to inhibit the nasal, lacrimal, gastric, and pancreatic glands. And basically, this is pretty much just to conserve energy so we can take that energy and deliver it to our skeletal muscle. Because remember, skeletal muscle, in order to contract, requires a massive amount of energy and oxygen, and energy mostly in the form of ATP. So if you're running for your life, you are using those skeletal muscles and you're burning that energy quickly. So you need to basically conserve all of the energy that you can in those other processes so that you can, get to safety. Okay. So the next thing down here is the salivary glands. So whenever you're running for your life, your saliva is much thicker, and you also start sweating because you're running. Additionally, this is the time that you're going to secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine, which these things are just fancy words for adrenaline. Additionally, you're so scared you might get goosebumps. That happens. And in terms of the heart muscle, it is going to increase the rate that the muscle contracts and also the force that the muscle contracts in the heart. And basically, this is just going to make your life easier by delivering oxygen more efficiently to your skeletal muscle. And so therefore you can continue to run for your life. In terms of the heart blood vessels, the heart vessels are going to dilate because the heart is working harder. That means it also needs energy to continue to be able to work hard. So therefore it needs its vessels that supply the heart muscle to be dilated so that it has enough oxygen so that you can continue pumping hard. Additionally, if you're running for your life, you probably don't want to stop for a pee break. And so this, the sympathetic nervous system is going to inhibit voiding of urine. It's also going to dilate the bronchioles, and this is going to help us. So the bronchioles are in the lungs. This is going to basically open up your airways so you can breathe better if you're running for your life. That's pretty important. Additionally, we are going to basically divert the activity and stop the activity of the digestive system. And this is really just an energy thing too. We don't necessarily want to be wasting energy breaking down food when we need that energy for our skeletal muscle. In terms of the liver, this is a pretty important one as well. The sympathetic nervous system is going to stimulate the release of glucose to the blood. This is important because glucose can be used to make ATP, to make energy. So we need more glucose. If we are burning energy, we need to get more glucose into the blood so that we can make more energy from that glucose. In terms of the gallbladder, it inhibits release from the gallbladder. Gallbladder releases a substance called bile, which is important for breaking down fats. Again, since we're not digesting anything, we don't need bile to be released. In terms of the kidneys, it's going to promote the release of renin, which causes vasoconstriction and decreases urine output because, again, remember, we don't need to stop for a pee break. I'm going to skip over these two for now because it's not necessarily relevant to our scenario, but it is important to take a look at those. Okay, so here's the important one. This is also a very important one, I should say. most vessels in the body, if you're running for your life, if your sympathetic nervous system is activated, most vessels are going to constrict, specifically in the skin and also in the digestive and abdominal regions. The reason for this is to basically divert that blood to the brain and the heart and the muscles. Because we are running for our life, it is very energy consuming. It's energy consuming for our brain, it's energy consuming for our heart and our skeletal muscle. So because we also have a very high need for oxygen, by diverting the blood away from our skin and from our abdominal regions, we are providing more oxygen to our muscles, brain, and heart to continue saving our life through running. Finally, the last couple of things that I'm going to talk about here, I'm going to skip over it. Coagulation, it's not really that relevant. Increasing metabolic rate, that's pretty important. So if you guys remember, I know I've asked you this several times, what is metabolism? And right now in your head, you should be thinking that metabolism is the amount of energy that you burn when you're just carrying out normal body processes and you're not really doing anything. Metabolism, you're going to be burning more energy in this sympathetic world. Okay, so that's going to increase your metabolic rate. And we're also in the sympathetic nervous system, when you're running for your life, we're also going to stimulate the breakdown of fat, because we can use the breakdown of fat to create more energy. Okay, so what I would do is I would just go through and memorize one of these things, and everything else is opposite. Notice also on this table, some things say no effect, no innervation. This is instances which these things are not duly innervated. They're only innervated by sympathetic, not okay, so those things are not innervated by the parasympathetic nervous system. Okay. All right. So now that we're done with that, I'll erase all this stuff. And let's move on. Okay, so we compared the autonomic nervous system to the somatic nervous system, and now we're going to compare the divisions of the autonomic nervous system to each other. So we're going to be comparing the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system in terms of their anatomical differences, okay? And anatomy is structure, so these are structural differences. And remember, physiology is functional differences. So that last table had a lot to do with the functional differences. Okay, what's the function of the sympathetic versus the parasympathetic? Now we're going to talk more about the structural, the anatomical differences between the two. So the first key anatomical difference that I'll discuss with you between the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system is the origin site. So as you can see, the parasympathetic nervous system is going to originate in the what we call the craniosacral regions. So that's going to include up here in the brainstem and then down in the sacral spinal cord regions, right? So that's where the pre-ganglionic fibers are going to come from. And those pre-ganglionic fibers here are going to be dark purple. The sympathetic nervous system is going to originate in the what we call the thoracolumbar region. So between the T1 level of the spinal cord, so T1 spinal nerves, through approximately L2, L1 spinal nerves. Okay, so parasympathetic is craniosacral and sympathetic is thoracolumbar. The second key anatomical difference between the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems are the fiber lengths. So in terms of the parasympathetic nervous system, we can see these preganglionic fibers, the dark purple ones here, are very long. And then there are relatively short postganglionic fibers, this is the lighter purple color. All right, so in the parasympathetic nervous system, we're going to have long preganglionic fibers and short postganglionic fibers. In the sympathetic nervous system, however, we're going to have relatively short preganglionic fibers, which you see in this darker green, and we're going to have very long postganglionic fibers. Okay, so that's the second key anatomical difference. The third key anatomical difference is where the ganglia are located. So in the parasympathetic nervous system, the ganglia, which would be basically where this synapse is occurring, so wherever the synapse is occurring between the pre and postganglionic fibers. In the parasympathetic nervous system, those ganglion are very close to the effector organs. Okay, you can see they're very, very close to the effector organs, sometimes on the effector organs themselves. In the sympathetic nervous system, the ganglion, which will all be located right here, up and down this chain, the sympathetic ganglion lie very close to the spinal cord. In fact, they lie usually just outside of the spinal cord, okay? So very close to the spinal cord.